The time was 1947. The place, Roswell, New Mexico. An unidentified flying object was seen to crash in the horizon. Many have no doubt heard this story, but do not know the secret details behind the crash. A saucer, seized by government officials, was secreted away, and using a black budget, they worked tirelessly, night and day, to reverse engineer technology at a remote top-secret location known only to the exterior world as Area 51. The technology which came from the circuitry and basic systems would re-emerge in the world of computing, the microtransistor. The operating system, though, which ran the ship and its navigational systems, this would be reassigned to data analysis of the human race, the stock market, weather patterns, constellations. Eventually, it would emerge as an artificial intelligence system designed to map and chart the form of esports teams and competitions. Alpha Draft. Play there, win money in their contests if you wish the Earth to live. Now then, RobbaN became the coach of FaZe, formerly known as G2, in early-ish February of this year, and in theory he's not only the coach, but presumably taking some aspect of an in-game leader type role. And he's someone who's an all-time great 1.6 player, but I know not many people in CSGO are going to know who this guy is. Well, he's 6th all-time on the prize money winnings list in 1.6. His team's won over $600,000, around $609,000, which makes him the 4th highest Swedish player of all time in terms of prize money won. So you know how many incredible Swedish players there were over all the years of CS. He had an amazing amount of longevity. That's part of why he was able to get to that over 600,000. He played for about 7.5 years as a reasonably high-level pro and a top-level pro. And despite the fact the guy won very few major tournaments, in fact, he only won one major in his career, he was able to get that high, where the company he's surrounded by is people like Forrest, Khan, the Poles, Neo, and Taz, etc., the people who have a bunch of majors, or in the case of the Poles, the most majors. So this is a guy who had a long and storied career. Now, where he essentially started was in a team called Big Grip. And in this team, which also had a couple of other rookies in that later on became quite famous, which was Forrest, one of the greatest players of all time, and Tentpole, a very underrated player in terms of history, not remembering him that well, but a fantastic player who just made some difficult roster moves, which didn't necessarily mean he got the chance to win as much as he could have done otherwise, but was on some very good Fnatic and SK gaming teams. So on this Big Grip team, one of the notable things was they got to attend a tournament called Wegg Masters Season 2, which took place in South Korea. And this was one where you had to go there and essentially live there for a month to compete in it. And the matches were like televised in some way and shown over the internet. And so you played games like week to week from a studio. And so because you had to go there for a whole month, a lot of teams from Europe, etc., had school and jobs and stuff. And so a lot of them at the time didn't actually want to go. And so there weren't that many elite teams going to these first seasons. And so Season 2, this Big Grip team got to go. And they were a team who at the time hadn't shown anything crazy back home. They weren't considered a top European team. But shockingly, they emerged at this tournament to have some very good players. Notably, the 3 players I've mentioned, Forrest, Tentpole and RobbaN. And they were able to actually win this tournament and become the champions. Now, they would also keep the lineup together. And at the end of the year, at CPL Winter event in December of 2005, I should have said the year, 2005, they finished 6th place here, and that was the last major of the year. So they showed they were a solid team there, but they weren't like world beaters. And winning Wegg Masters, like I said, there wasn't any elite level teams there, so it was a solid result. Now what happens then is, that's the end of 2005, so obviously Forrest and Tentpole go off, and at the beginning of 2006, they form Fnatic and go on to become a great team there. Now, RobbaN initially doesn't go to Fnatic. He doesn't go to any top team. He just chills for a while. Like around, I think it was around March or so, he's like joining up with NIP in some format, where at the time NIP was like Zet, Heaton, let me think, who else was in that one? Vale, who else would it be? I think at the time, Potty might have already retired at that point in time. And he initially, I think, joined up because he was like a stand-in for when they played, I think it was at Inferno Online, like a LAN cafe. They played a show match against Complexity of Fraud and Sunman and Storm and those guys. But anyway, later in the year, he would actually get called up to the lineup like for real. Like it worked out, they liked it. And so he comes into NIP, this team. And later in the year, they'd even get Spawn as well. So the team then had this sick run over 2006 where they won DreamHack Summer, they won NGL 1 Season 1, they won Code 5, they won DreamHack Winter at the end of the year. Yeah, they had the problem was they were very, very good. This team is one of the great teams of all time, this NIP lineup. But the problem is, first of all, as a lineup, it doesn't work because they added Spawn after a couple of the early wins. But as for the whole year, they were the best team of the year overall. The problem is they won mainly the medium-sized events. Like the events with good prize money and solid teams there and good competition, but not the majors. Like at ESWC, they only made the round of 8. And then at World Cyber Games, they were favourites to win. They were in the final and they shockingly lost to the Poles. So obviously ended up becoming an all-time great team. So they took the silver medal there. At the WSVG, which was a massive tournament where 50k was for first place, they bombed out really early there. At CPL Winter, the last major of the year, they did fairly poorly there as well. Their problem was just at the majors. And in medium-sized tournaments, they were fantastic. So actually, what's interesting about that is that ended up being the story of RobbaN's career in many ways. And that kind of foreshadowed what his whole career would be like. That what's interesting, though, to note, though, in 2006 is that team actually beat Fnatic a lot. This is before Fnatic had gotten to the point where they were winning big majors. That didn't happen until the very end of the year. They weren't winning competitions before then in terms of the big lands. So at the time, NIP was actually the kryptonite to Fnatic. They were just beating them every time they played them. And so guys like Forrest, etc., hadn't become known as the best player in the world yet. They were just good players, like rising stars, who people wanted to see what they do next. At the time, someone like Forrest was comparable to... let me think, who should I pick now? I'd say comparable to like what Skadoodle was last year, or comparable to, let me think, maybe what Guardian is this year. Like, maybe not Guardian because he's been around too many years. So in 2007, because at the end of 2006, the NIP team broke up. Like their best player was Zet, and he left and went off to go join Complexity in America, and then some of the other players distributed elsewhere. Well, RobbaN goes with Spawn, and they join up with SK, which is the old home of Spawn from before. Now, early on, this team had many struggles. They had a bunch of tournaments that were like really mediocre for what you expect of SK, like finishing 4th or worse. But they had this fluke win where they actually managed to beat the Poles at the SEC, which is the Samsung European Championship, basically like a European version of the World Cyber Games. They managed to have this crazy run there and fluke it from the lower bracket and win the tournament. Wait, actually, it might have been the upper bracket. Yeah, I think it was the upper bracket, actually. They had... because that was like the one good result, they were messing with the lineup over the summer, trying different players, some of them not that good. What eventually turned it around for this team in RobbaN was they brought in Tentpole, who had left Fnatic at the end of 2006, early 2007. He comes into the lineup, and suddenly the lineup becomes really solid. Like, for the last few months of the year, they're like the second best team in the world. They finished second at IEM LA to Fnatic. They finished second at DreamHack Winter. I think that was actually to an MIBR lineup with Bit. And 2008 comes along, and 2008 is one of the most competitive years in the history of Counter-Strike. This was one where the number of elite teams was like 4 or 5 elite teams. And they could all beat each other in different scenarios. Like, not every single team could beat the other ones, but collectively, there's A beats B, B beats C, C beats D, that sort of a scenario, like a circular type scenario. Then outside of the top 4 or 5, you had these like 2 or 3 teams that were like really solid dark horse challengers that could beat some of these teams in certain matchups, and themselves would every now and then win a tournament or get a sick run to the finals. So it was a super competitive year. And in this year, SK unfortunately were one of the teams who suffered from that. Like Fnatic, it was Fnatic and SK really were the ones who didn't really win that many big titles. They were the ones who mainly had a lot of top 4s, a lot of smaller successes, but never really got the big ones and never got as great a year as teams like MTW, Mouse Sports, Estro. So this year, 2008, was mainly about being a solid, consistent team. A lot of top 4s. Eventually, towards the end of the year, they managed to get Zet back. Overall, they did manage to go to 4 finals, but 2 of them were smaller finals. Like, there was IEM3 LA, which was the one that they actually won. They beat MIBR in the final. Then there was IEM3 Montreal, which is the one they lost to Fnatic in the final, where Forrest went absolutely ham on Inferno. There was World Cyber Games, where they played MTW in the final, so another World Cyber Games final, and another loss for RobbaN. And MTW were the best team of the year, by the way. And DreamHack Winter was where... let me think. Anyway, they made it to the final of DreamHack Winter. They had Zet back in the lineup, who'd been his NIP teammate, and that helped turn things around a bit, even though Zet himself wasn't playing that sick, really. In 2009, which then comes along, The team initially started slow, but then they had this nice run of some big second places, which put them again at the stats of being like maybe the second best team in the world. They had second place at ESWC Chernan and Code 5, both second places to Fnatic, who obviously went on to be the dominant team of the year, an incredible team. Unfortunately, in the summer, SK get humiliated by a Lemon Dogs team, which was actually a mixed team. So in the final of this tournament, a real team, one of the best teams in the world, goes there and they play a mixed team, which was 3 players from what was essentially like H2K, which was Threat, Crystal, and FaZe, and Gux and Get Right from Fnatic, two new stars of Fnatic, which played as like stand-ins there, and that mixed team managed to beat SK 2-1 in the final, even though they were just a mix. So as a result, SK, famous for always making roster moves when things went bad, actually just went out and bought 2 of those players. They got Crystal and they got FaZe, the 2 other star players aside from Gux and Get Right of that lineup, because Threat was the in-game leader and just the brains. So they get those players and it worked out. The first tournament, they beat the unbeatable Fnatic. They won IEM Chengdu, then at IEM Dubai. Unfortunately, they had to settle for 3rd there because they actually lost to, let me think. Was it actually, I think it was it Fnatic who wrecked them there? I think it might have been Fnatic who wrecked them there. And yeah, I think they did. I think they got bodied by Fnatic in the semis. But they beat the Poles and finished, who were at the time Vitriolic, and finished 3rd place overall. Still a decent finish. At the end of the year, they had a bad performance at DreamHack Winter where they lost to MTW, who had a stand-in, who had this miracle run, but it was a close series. They could have won that. They were still a good top team. And then they won Arbalete Cup Europe, one of the first big Arbalete tournaments. And that was big time, because to win that tournament, they had to beat MTW again. There was no Fnatic, but there was the Poles were there, Evil Geniuses were there. It was a very good lineup. So overall, they showed themselves to be one of the best teams of the year and a very solid team again. And you notice throughout his whole career, RobbaN's teams are always very solid and in the elite tier, even though they're not always winning the big tournaments. 2010 comes along, and this was a really up and down year, because in this year, they started out real slow, but then they got Gux, because he'd left Fnatic in some shocking scenario. So they got Gux in. Gux starts to heat up, get better and better. They finished 3rd at IEM Global Championships, which was a major at the time, the big major. Then they had this Arbalete Best of 4 tournament, which was 4 teams went there as like an exhibition. It was like Fnatic, it was SK, it was Na'Vi, and it was this team called United, who was like another Arbalete sponsored team, who were a mixture of teams from the players from the CIS region. And at this tournament, they actually placed ahead of Fnatic. They finished 2nd overall behind Na'Vi, who at the time Na'Vi were establishing themselves as the new dominant team. DreamHack Summer, they beat Na'Vi, but only finished 4th overall. They didn't manage to get past MTW in the semi-finals, who won that tournament. So they were showing they were still a very dangerous elite team. They won the Inferno Online League, beating Fnatic there, I think that was, in the final. So this was quite shocking stuff, because they were again contending to be the best team in the world, but Na'Vi was out in front, and then gradually it started to pull away from them, and they just became like a top 4, top 5 team that year. ESWC, they managed to finish 2nd place there, but lost to Na'Vi. Then Gux left, and then things went downhill. They started to have not very good results. They were only winning like smaller European competitions. So towards the end of the year, there's a tournament called WEM, which was actually the ancestor, I guess you wouldn't say ancestor, you'd say successor to the Wegg Masters type tournaments. This is the World Esports Masters, and it was taking place in China, in Hangzhou. Now, here, RobbaN didn't attend the tournament. He didn't want to go, and so they used Delpan as a stand-in and had a miracle run and came 2nd, actually, to We Made Fox. And it was a very stacked tournament, so they had a great result there. And the last result of the year, they just finished round of 8 at DreamHack Winter, which is quite poor overall. They lost in a stellar fashion, though, because it was an amazing series they had against Na'Vi. I think I'm thinking of the right one there. No, I think I've got that wrong, actually. That was the next year. Okay, never mind that. That didn't happen. So, in 2011... here's where it gets interesting, because at the end of 2010, Forest and Get Right leave Fnatic, the 2 stars of Fnatic. So they come over to SK, and RobbaN's now got Khan's star players, basically. Now he's got a chance to run with them, and he does. Initially, they fail. Initially, they had some difficulties getting towards the top. They were like, didn't even make the playoffs of the first big tournament. Then at the big World Championship, they only finished like top 4, and then at Copenhagen Games, they finished 2nd. But then they had this little streak over the summer where they were winning a bunch of tournaments and they were the best team. They had 4 straight finals. They finished 2nd at Copenhagen Games to the Poles. They won DreamHack Summer, even beating Na'Vi and MTW there. They won Game Goon. Again, a bunch of top teams there, Na'Vi, Fnatic. They came 2nd at Wegg E-Stars, where they lost to the Poles again. So they lost to the Poles in 2 of those key finals, and that would be another trend of RobbaN's career, losing to the Poles again and again in finals and big semis. Towards the end of the year, they managed to pick it up again and won ESWC, the first major of RobbaN's career. And to win it, they had to beat out Na'Vi in the final in incredible fashion. They went to the World Cyber Games. They made it to the final. It was a very weak field that year, but the Poles were there in the final. It was a crazy series, back 2-1, and they lost 2-1, and RobbaN had to get another silver medal at World Cyber Games. Now, what's crazy is, towards the end of the year, the last 3 or 4 months, the only teams SK ever lost to in Best of X series were the Poles, the guys who were in Frag Executors, and then later on ESC, and Na'Vi. Those were the only 2 teams, the 2 best teams in the world, basically, and they only ever lost to them, but they always lost to them, unfortunately, except for the odd instance, like ESWC, where they beat them in the final. So, yeah, it was kind of disappointing stuff overall. Then, when you look at 2012, CS 1.6 initially only lasted the first few months as a big game. Then it was still around for like 4 or 5 more months as Fnatic kept winning tournaments, but it was getting smaller and smaller. People were transitioning to CSGO, people were dropping teams, and SK's team got dropped in the middle of the year. Part of the reason they got dropped is they started out the year with like a second place to Na'Vi at IEM Kiev, but then it started to go downhill quite rapidly. They'd brought in Trace, the Danish star from MTW, to bring their lineup, but the problem is he's a very passive, defensive style player, fantastic at it, but they already had a lot of those in the team. They needed a bit more aggressive style, and so the team became actually a bit worse as a result. And then the worst result was probably Copenhagen Games, where they didn't do very well at all, and so as a result the team got dropped, and RobbaN essentially disappeared from the public's sphere at that point in time. Now, one of the defining characteristics of RobbaN's career, unfortunately, is that despite all those careers, despite being in a top 5, top 3, top 2 team for a number of these years, he didn't win a major title until he got Forrest and Get Right, 2 of the all-time great players, which was in 2011, when he won ESWC 2011. Before that, he had so many instances where he had breakdowns. And even with them, there were some key breakdowns. So before then, he'd had World Cyber Games 2006 final, he lost to Pentagram, which was Neo and Taz, the Poles. World Cyber Games 2008 final, he lost to MTW, who were the best team at the time, who had Wimp, who had Sunder, who had Ave. Even with Forrest and Get Right, he still had a number of key breakdowns. In the semi-final of the IEM 5 World Championship, they played against Frag Executors, which was the Poles of Neo and Taz, and they lost like a 14-16 third map on Dust 2, where it was an impossible comeback by the Poles. It's the one where famously they start crying in that like esports, this is not a game video, or whatever the fuck that's called. There was the World Cyber Games final, the same year that they lost to the Poles, similar fashion, heartbreaking fashion in the third map. Then the next year, a few months later, IEM 6 World Championships, then semi-finals against ESC, which is the Poles. They kept changing organisation names. They lose that in like 14-16 on the last map, which I think was Train. And again, heartbreak. They're always losing super close, always losing like 14-16 in the last map. So many heartbreaking, crushing losses for RobbaN in his career to stop him getting major titles, basically. Also, his teams in general, aside from the NIP teams, famously lost a lot to Fnatic. The SK teams he was a part of lost to Fnatic a lot, the majority of the time. And as a result, helped Fnatic win a lot of the titles. They also lost a lot to the Poles, Neo and Taz. That was the number 1 enemies for them, who they'd always have more skill on the SK lineup, but the Poles would somehow have more clutch factor. They had Neo, who could be the better player than everyone on SK, and they could always get it done in those important moments. And that's why the Poles have all the majors, and people like SK, RobbaN and Vale don't have any, except RobbaN has 1, Vale has none. So he is someone who won a lot of medium-sized tournaments in his career, lots of them, and had many, many top 4s at majors and medium-sized tournaments and finals as well. So as a result, aside from major titles, one of the greatest players of all time, one of the most decorated players of all time, but also he was mainly like a 3rd star in teams as an individual player, and then like an in-game leader towards the end there. So as a skill set, he had good rifles, not super sick, but good, solid spray. He had good AWP. He was mainly good as a secondary AWPer, but he'd mix it up and use it on certain maps. He was more of a CT side player, I always thought, in terms of individual skills. Unfortunately, because of this trend of always finishing second in those big majors and always failing to get past the top 4 if it was a team that you're playing who were going to win, he did have a reputation as a choker. There's a reason why he had so many times in the final where he lost. And I think there's probably something to that. It did seem to have some sort of breakdown when he was in those big situations, almost what you think of with Astralis now for most of their careers. There was a while where he was an in-game leader, where he actually seemed fairly effective as an in-game leader because he could frag while doing it. So I think in late 2008 in SK he tried it. Then in like mid-2010 he took over. And I know for all of 2011 when Vale was gone, he was the in-game leader at that point in time. The thing as an in-game leader is he had like good strats as an in-game leader. He had a mixture of like actual set strats and then a bit of loose calling. But they weren't like the sickest strats. They weren't on the level of like Ave and Zeus and God B. He wasn't quite on this level. Although in terms of fragging, I guess you'd compare him more to a God B than some of those other guys. He also seemed to rely, I always thought, as an in-game leader, a bit too much on trying to read the enemy and then call his strats based on that. I mean, I realize you're supposed to do that, but sometimes I felt like he didn't have the best intuitive sense for always reading the enemy, and so he would make calls based on that that sometimes be wrong, whereas sometimes just sticking with the default and playing out of it with some of the star players he had might have been a better approach. Now, it did work out famously in one very key instance, which is in the ESWC 2011 final when they played Na'Vi. The first map, I think, was the one that was Inferno, and they were down something crazy. Like, I think they were down, like, I think they only won 3 CT rounds on the first half, did SK, on Inferno, which at the time was a map where usually you'd be expecting to get like at least 8 or 9 rounds on CT. But then they go to T-side, and RobbaN did read the game fantastically against Na'Vi's defense and picked them apart and got it to overtime. He had a 12-round T-half. Got it to overtime, and then they won in overtime, especially famously with a get-right 1v3 that was fantastic at the A site. Now, in terms of recruitment and other things, that's an area where I feel like RobbaN had some issues. Like, he always did a good job in recruiting new skill into the team. They did, over the years, they did a decent job in his teams of doing that. The problem is, it seemed like he had some sort of a cabal with Vale, that they were like, okay, we agree not to cut each other. We'll cut anyone else when you have problems, but we won't cut each other at any point in time. And so as a result, they never did cut each other until the end of 2010 when Vale went out and they got Forest and Get Right, but they should have done it earlier because one of the two needed to go. Now, both of them could be good individual players, both of them could be good in-game leaders, but they were never going to be fantastic, and as a result, I always felt like it held SK back a little bit in terms of not quite enough stars, and also it held them back in terms of they should have only had one of these guys who had like a choking issue, had some aspects of that, and were both similar sorts of in-game leader in terms of the style of how they do it. So I don't think it's any coincidence that when they did finally remove one of them, Vale in this case, they had all the success in 2011. Now, they did get Forest and Get Right, but even so, they had fantastic players before that. Tentpole, other guys, Spawn, obviously. So, yeah. Also, you have to look at the fact that in terms of recruitment, they sometimes were a bit hasty with people. They bring them in for short term, then cut them if it didn't work out and bring someone else in. So they could have had Delpan earlier than that. They could have had someone like Modi if they'd ever wanted him. They could have had Get Right, and famously they let him go, and then a few months later he went and joined Fnatic and became fantastic and one of the best players in the world. But anyway, RobbaN is one of the greatest players of all time. I'll be interested to see what he does as a coach, because actually I think his style of in-game leadership probably should fit the FaZe team in terms of they've got good skill, decent breakdown of roles, and they just need to be put in position where they have a basis of what to do, a system that they can play out of, and then either, hopefully he can make calls when they don't know what to do, but otherwise, they play out of the system and then individual plays spur what they're going to do from that point in time. And Makalele gets his picks, and Jacob and AZ go crazy in terms of just pure fragging. And then you have Rain winning clutch rounds. Hopefully they can have a setup in this particular sense that would work.
Hey, I'm Hiko, the Master Baiter, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube.